The challenges we face have grown large enough that it makes more sense these days to speak of climate breakdown rather than mere climate change. And as if the epic problems addressed by that label weren't enough, we also have to contend with the related issues of loss of biodiversity, runaway technological change, rising authoritarianism, all of which has led some to say that we are not just in a crisis, but a polycrisis, which might be defined simply as no matter which way you turn, there's trouble. And if you try to address a small piece of it, you find yourself entangled in lots more than you may have bargained for. What this suggests to me is that the trouble we face is only partly a matter of what fuels we use and how we choose to feed ourselves and even how we vote. Those are some of the narrowish frames that have often been used to oppose meaningful climate progress. Instead, the polycrisis we face is at least as much a problem of story as it is of logistics or infrastructure. If we don't address how we talk about climate breakdown, we're not going to be able to address the challenges of dealing with it in a meaningful way. We're not going to be able to work collectively to craft a better future together. We're not even going to be able to effectively figure out how to understand it ourselves. I'm not a climate scientist. Instead, I consider myself to be sort of a story scientist. Ever since I read Tom Sawyer and Greek mythology and The Lord of the Rings as a kid, I've been fascinated by how storytellers craft worlds with words. And so as I saw the climate crisis grow worse and worse in recent years and still be neglected in the worlds of politics and policy, I decided to conduct a sort of thought experiment. What if the climate crisis were not happening for real? What if the whole mess were only a story someone had concocted? The same way storytellers in Hollywood and elsewhere have long crafted sagas about love and war, family dynasties and dysfunctions, and even nuclear war and zombie apocalypse. If our climate present and our climate future were fictional, someone would have had to come up with rules and assumptions about how that fictional world operates. So what would those assumptions be? Who would benefit from them? Who would be left out? This sort of experiment grows out of a lot of thinking over many, many human generations about rhetoric and how humans craft stories. In Western history, that thinking is documented going all the way back to Aristotle, who used the idea of the, quote, narrative arc to explain why stories like the Odyssey are so compelling. The fundamental idea is that stories have shapes, and that good storytellers use those shapes to guide their listeners or readers or viewers. They balance time and plot, character and tension. Even if the shape is hidden from the audience, it absolutely determines their experience. In many instances, we're really good at picking out those shapes. Let's say we run into one another on the sidewalk this evening and I blurt out, "You'll never believe what happened today." Depending on the mood you see in me, you'll pretty quickly figure out what sort of story is coming. Is it tragic, like a car crash or a bad medical diagnosis? Someone getting fired? Or is it a funny story, maybe even a ridiculous joke? Is it a new social media outrage? These are all different types of stories that demand different responses. And in our everyday lives, we're really good at picking out the cues that tell us what kind of story is coming. Those cues then determine whether we should respond with a laugh or a sympathetic smile or a gasp. They tell us how to integrate the new information within our existing worldview. Or sometimes, rarely, they're out of the box enough to rock that worldview, which can be a shattering experience. But it's different when we get to the shapes of large-scale narratives shared in a society, which we tend to access in large part through various media rather than through a simple conversation. They're usually so cloaked in symbolism and buzzwords and assumptions that their shape remains deeply hidden. And that's especially true when the topic of the narrative is complicated and challenging, which is certainly the case with climate breakdown. When we're faced with information that we really don't want to hear, it's a lot of work to fully process it, especially if doing so might force us to adjust our worldview. It's a lot easier to stick with the worldview we already have and to hear the new information from that perspective. In other words, rather than being conscious of what sort of story we're hearing, we don't question it because we've already bought into all the story's rules and assumptions. This sort of shortcut has brought us to a point where there are a few dominant large-scale narratives of climate breakdown that are easy to latch onto. They're comfortable to latch onto. And each one links readily to particular worldviews. Most notoriously, there's denial or a stance that says climate change can't be happening, or that it isn't linked to human activities. It says that humans really can't change the Earth's climate to any significant degree, or that what's happening now is no different than so-called natural climate change that has happened in the past. An offshoot of this is the religious fundamentalist narrative that says climate change is God's work. In a poll done in the US in 2016, 14% of respondents said that climate change is probably a sign of the biblical end times, and another 18% said it might be. That's a third of the electorate who probably won't place the climate high on their list of priorities, because addressing this issue would directly clash with a very deep worldview they hold. Still, others believe that climate breakdown is an occasion to make money, which is certainly true. Change brings opportunity, even when its overall impact is negative. By now, most people know about the ongoing efforts by fossil fuel companies to keep extracting and selling their product, even when the dire consequences have long been known. They constitute clear evidence that short-term greed can outweigh almost any other consideration. And the same can be said for the politicians who support that strategy. A version of this storyline that might seem more promising on the face of it is so-called green growth, which is based on the idea that we can invent and innovate our way to a climate-friendly society without having to make major sacrifices in our way of life. But the technical and pollution hurdles to this are huge. And the fact is that this sort of focus on some imagined future economy can be a huge distraction from the pressing need to cut emissions today. Finally, a major emerging climate breakdown narrative is proliferating fast, especially among young people. It's despair. The sinking feeling that humans simply can't deal with the problem fast enough or in a big enough way to assure a livable future. There was a global survey in 2021 that found that more than 45% of people 25 and under reported that climate anxiety affects their daily functioning. Now, on the face of it, these narratives seem very different. They even contradict one another. But in a very important way, they have a similar structure. They're all tragedies in the sense that the ancient Greeks meant when they developed the roots of our Western literary traditions dozens of centuries ago. What characterizes a tragedy is that the conditions that begin the story can't be changed later. Think of Oedipus, who in his youth hears a prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother. He doesn't want that. So he structures his life to avoid that fate. But what happens? His elaborate efforts themselves make the prophecy come true. To the ancient Greeks, the beauty of stories like this lay not in possible changes to the plot, but in the strength of character or the grace that people stuck in bad situations can bring to bear. In tragedy, the outcome can't ever change. And that laser focus on the ending shapes everything that happens long before. Does this sound familiar? Does it help illustrate how most of our shared climate breakdown narratives are in fact tragic in their structure? I think it does. And here I have to give credit that making a connection between how we structure stories and how we make decisions about nature and how we live in it is not an entirely original idea on my part. Way back in 1974, in the thick of the wave of environmental consciousness that crested with the first Earth Day and a whole raft of environmental protection legislation signed by a Republican president, a literary scholar named Joseph Meeker was writing about connections between our literary traditions and how we treat our surroundings. Meeker had the advantage of being not just a literary scholar, but also a Park Service naturalist. So he was in kind of a unique position to assess what sorts of stories people tell themselves to situate themselves in their environment. What Meeker wrote back then in a book called The Comedy of Survival was that tragic art, quote, describes a world in which the processes of nature are relatively unimportant and always subservient to the spirit of man. He wrote that rejection of the tragic view of life may be necessary in order to end the long and disastrous warfare between mankind and the natural world. He wrote that freedom from the need for tragedy is an important precondition for the avoidance of ecological catastrophe. This was 50 years ago. That was long before climate breakdown became a front-page source of worry. But I think Meeker's core insight has never been truer than today. Many of our shared narratives of climate breakdown are fundamentally tragic. They all have embedded in them pre-existing conditions and the assumption that those conditions can't change. Denialists say that humans can't do anything consequential enough to change the global climate in a bad way. Many religious fundamentalists assume that management of the global climate is simply above the pay grade of human beings. So they say they're willing to leave the decision-making entirely to God. In the case of green growth, or even the sort of end times capitalism, currently making plans to profit from flood and fire and drought, the assumption is that the economy has to keep growing no matter what. 30 years ago, George H.W. Bush said, "The American way of life is not up for negotiations," before the Earth Summit in Rio. Of course, by, quote, way of life, he meant a pretty narrow set of possibilities, all closely allied with traditional ideas and metrics about so-called economic progress. That prevailing attitude hasn't changed much. So you might say that the prevailing message of tragic narratives can be summed up in a single word: no. The despair narrative is also tragic because it assumes that individuals and societies can't change quickly enough to make a difference. It implies there's not much reason to try. I know. In researching my book, Beyond Climate Breakdown, I spent about 3 years reading a lot of really dark material about climate breakdown. Projections of heat waves and melting ice sheets, or terrifying feedback loops that the physical world can experience. This is knowledge that results directly from the advanced nature of climate science. And it is a fact that scientists in many specialties have a much clearer window into the future than ever before. So despair grows out of what seems like humanity's most advanced bodies of knowledge. Is it possible that they too are getting us off track? To me, the answer to this question, or at least the direction of inquiry it points me to, is to dig even deeper into the science of storytelling. It's to ask a further question about tragedy, namely, who gets to make the decisions that shape how the story goes? If we go back to ancient Greek tragedy, the answer seems obvious. In the case of Oedipus, the answer is Sophocles, the playwright who wrote the script. Of course, Sophocles was also shaped by the environment he was working in, which included rich narrative traditions and an immersive worldview that dictated how gods were understood to behave and what the resulting limits on human agency were. But still, there's a name, there's an author, there's a finite set of decisions that he made about what the boundaries of Oedipus's behavior and decision-making could be. Now let's try applying that same sort of question about authorship to large-scale climate breakdown narratives. Who writes them? Who decides? It's immediately clear that there isn't any one named author, as there most often is with literary or creative works. But still, there's a limited set of authors, which is largely powerful interests in politics and religion and business and the media. Together, they shape public conceptions of what is economically feasible, or, as the phrase goes, politically possible, even when those conceptions run counter to everyone's long-term interests. So one of the helpful outcomes of analyzing story structures is that we can start to define who those limited sets of authors are and what their goals are, and then figure out how to respond. Joseph Meeker wrote all those years ago, Without a personality to focus upon, ecological crisis presents merely a spectacle of catastrophe with none of the redemptive prospects of genuine tragic experience. So there can be a benefit to thinking about particular people, particular agencies and organizations. As humans easily subject to the influence of narratives, we need to put faces on both villains and good guys. And that may help us in real instrumental ways. If we look forward into coming decades of climate breakdown, it's not hard to imagine scenarios in which those responsible for continuing expansions of fossil fuel infrastructure, even as the dire consequences are known, become legally liable for their actions, as has already happened with tobacco companies. But I believe this sort of analysis is really more important for how it helps the literally billions of people around the world who believe that climate action is essential and urgently needs to be ramped up. Because it can help us figure out how to get away from stories that locate meaning only in how we negotiate a march toward a cataclysmic ending. But I believe this sort of analysis is way more important for how it helps the literally billions of people around the world who believe that climate action is essential and urgently needs to be ramped up. It can help us figure out how to get away from stories that locate meaning only in how we negotiate a march toward a cataclysmic ending. Those are dead-end stories, quite literally. So how do we move from them toward stories of possibility and persistence? Well, understanding how tragic narratives are shaped opens the door to those alternatives that better serve our need for climate action. So here's my suggestion on how to do this. Again, it's going to be tied to Joseph Meeker's. If tragedy is the problem, then let's look to its mirror twin, comedy. Even the ancient Greeks did this. When tragedies were performed, they weren't performed alone. Tragic dramas were typically intermingled with comedies that lightened the mood and that also shed a critical light on the weightiness of the tragedy. And I think the audience needed this implicit critique, this reminder that not all the good stories are tragic, and that there are, in fact, bigger story frames out there that are often more closely tied to our everyday experience. Think about it this way. Tragedy supports the status quo by stiffly decreeing that the rules can't change. Comedy always pokes at the status quo. Comedy is rife with cross-dressing, with people dressing up as animals. It's the place where jesters can ridicule the king. It's the place where deeper truths about the human condition are revealed through the banishment of boundaries. It's the place where possibilities that weren't even a glint in anyone's eye when the story began become real through the deployment of the one rule all improv comedians always have to follow, which is say yes. Naturalist as he was, Meeker saw a ready model for this practice of adaptability in the natural world. It's evolution. The time-tested model of experimentation between life forms and their environment that constantly plays and improvises, pushes and pulls, adapts and shapeshifts. Evolution sees to it that life persists even as its environment changes because it aims at one goal, which is persistence into the future, survival. An evolutionary way to think about our climate predicament is this. However much we think we know about where we're going, our path into the future is never clear in the present. There's too much we don't know about how human beings are going to respond. But what is clear is that we have the ability to try everything to get there. Evolution thrives on the unexpected, on the it's never been done quite this way before. Evolution is epitomized by something like the duck-billed platypus, this funny animal in Australia that has fur and a duck bill, and whose females lay eggs. When the first specimens of the duck-billed platypus made their way to Europe after the English settlement of Australia, the biologists at the time thought it was a joke. They thought some taxidermists in Australia were having a laugh at their expense because the platypus didn't fit the models of what a mammal is, or any other sort of animal for that matter. And it wasn't for a while that the Biologists at the time figured out, no, this is real. So that's how evolution works, through experiments. Many of those experiments fail, but others survive in ways that no one saw coming. So I'm going to give you a few ideas, 6 ideas on how to implement ideals of comedy in how we deal with climate breakdown. And I want to point out they aren't all funny, because comedy can be much deeper than humor. Humor is important, and it really has been shown to help people get through all sorts of dire situations, as well as our everyday lives. But these ideas all do center a certain open-heartedness or a lightheartedness that is often the precondition for effectively dealing with a tough situation. Number 1, talk about it. Just talk about it. Polling shows that the great majority of Americans worry about climate change, but only a minority regularly talk about it with their friends, their families, their coworkers. This is a setup for despair and hopelessness. It makes everyone think they're alone. By talking about climate breakdown's challenges and possibilities, all of us can assure others that they are not alone. The fact is, worrying about climate breakdown is normal and healthy. By broadly seeing that in one another, we lay the groundwork for societal understanding that addressing climate breakdown is going to be the great intergenerational task for all of us that will define what it means to be human into the foreseeable future. Number 2, acknowledge the emotion or the emotions. Taking a clear look at climate breakdown is hard. Fortunately, humans have some good tools for dealing with hard truths. Join a climate cafe, a small group discussion that provides an open forum for sharing worries and responses. If you can't find one, start your own. Or check out the Good Grief Network, which provides a structured path for turning concern into action. Find someone you can talk to about eco-anxiety. Remember that worry about our shared home is not a disability. It's a sign of being a healthy human inhabitant. Number 3, pass the mic. Most Americans hear about climate breakdown more from the media or politicians than they do from one another at a more personal level. This continues the tragic perspective because it reinforces the idea that it is elites who have the right to shape the narrative. We can all push back by ensuring that the widest possible range of our fellow humans have a chance to give voice to their climate breakdown stories and perspectives and responses. It's especially important to hear from those whose voices have been largely neglected in the past. Number 4, envision the future wildly. We need to do a lot more imagining of what the world can look like. This means starting not only with what we have now, but with what we'd like to see. No, imagination alone doesn't take us there. But there's zero chance of getting there if we can't first start envisioning futures that are more hopeful and life-affirming. Putting those ideas out there helps oppose the dead weight of tragic narratives. As Gopal Dayaneni of Movement Generation has put it, the solutions we need are going to happen through a contest over the very question of what is possible. And so every time we put the idea of a better alternative out into the world, it weakens the inertia of the past. Number 5, put in sweat equity, using your body. In a media-saturated time, information unadulterated by physical experience has the potential to put us in a deep funk. We've all been there. But the imbalance many feel between information and action means that the latter can take on great power. By working within the splendid physical bodies we have, especially in collaboration with others, we reestablish very basic human ties to place and to purpose. Work toward a small goal. Work in your neighborhood. It will make bigger goals more possible down the road. And number 6, believe in hope. But it has to be radical hope. Hope often gets a bad rap because it can mean passively waiting around for someone else to do the right thing. But hope that is meaningful is an active process. Sometimes it means acting with hope even when the mind or heart aren't persuaded yet that it's warranted. And sometimes the action can make the hope real. And hope further becomes radical when it is latched to an acceptance of uncertainty. No, we can't know for sure what our climate futures are going to look like. But if some outcomes might be worse than we imagine, others may be better than we can imagine. It takes effort to twist the narrative framing of climate breakdown in this way, to see it not primarily as an existential challenge, but rather as a great opportunity to reshape and improve how we relate to one another and to the planet on which we live. But the truth is, climate breakdown is both. It's a great peril, and it's a great catalyst. If we view it only as tragedy, a tragic outcome is foreordained. If we can act as though it can also be a very different sort of story, there's at least a chance we might be able to call a very different sort of plot into being.